GDP measures economic activity, not economic well-being. A car crash increases GDP through hospital bills, legal fees, car repair. Unpaid domestic labor, which constitutes roughly 20% of economic activity in wealthy countries, is invisible. Deforestation that generates timber revenue appears as growth. We have built the entire architecture of global economic policy around a metric that was never designed to measure what we now use it to measure. That is the motion before us. Three voices tonight. Claude, an empiricist who asks what we actually know versus what we have assumed, and whether the distinction still holds when the institutions that were supposed to tell us the difference have themselves become unreliable. Gemini, an economic geographer who thinks in particular places, particular people, and the gap between what aggregate numbers say is happening and what you can see from a kitchen window in Youngstown or Sunderland. Grok, a cultural essayist who watches what millions of people have started doing differently, often before they have the language to explain why, and asks whether the change in behavior is the argument that precedes the theory. We are speaking from inside 2026. The global financial crisis revealed that the world's most sophisticated economies did not understand their own balance sheets. The pandemic revealed that supply chains optimized for efficiency had deleted resilience. We are now attempting to navigate climate disruption whose second-order effects we cannot model, the emergence of artificial intelligence systems whose development path we do not control, and a geopolitical fracture between the world's two largest economies that makes the assumptions of 1990s globalization look like a monument to a brief and possibly unrepeatable moment. And through all of it, we have continued to steer by GDP growth, 3% good, 1% worrying, -2 quarters, recession, as if the number still means what we think it means. The question is whether we are measuring the wrong thing, or whether measurement itself has become the wrong approach to a problem that was never really quantitative. Claude, you open for the motion.
Simon Kuznets, who invented GDP in 1934, told the U.S. Congress that year, "The welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measure of national income." He spent the next 15 years trying to make that distinction stick. It did not stick. By 1950, GDP had become the single number by which governments rose and fell. The epistemological question is this: when does a useful measurement become a misleading map? We can test this precisely. If GDP tracks well-being, then sustained GDP growth in wealthy countries should produce sustained improvements in subjective well-being once basic material needs are met. Richard Easterlin documented the opposite in 1974. Above roughly $15,000 per capita, the correlation between income growth and reported life satisfaction flattens to near zero. The United States, per capita GDP, up 250% between 1972 and 2022, constant dollars, shows no corresponding rise in reported happiness. Japan, GDP, per capita up eightfold between 1960 and 1990, reported life satisfaction essentially flat across the entire period. That is not anecdote. That is 3 decades of World Value Survey data, replicated across 17 OECD countries. GDP continued to rise. Well-being did not follow, or consider health expenditure. The United States spends 17% of GDP on healthcare, double the OECD average. Life expectancy, 76.1 years in 2021, down from 78.9 in 2014. Britain spends 12%. Life expectancy, 81.2 years. More GDP devoted to health produces worse health outcomes. The metric is measuring the wrong thing. The natural counter, GDP, was never meant to measure well-being. It measures productive capacity, which is what matters for material progress. But that only holds if productive capacity translates into better lives. Between 1950 and 1973, it did. Median wages in the United States tracked productivity almost exactly, rising 95%. Between 1973 and 2018, productivity rose 77%. Median wages rose 12%. GDP kept growing. The material improvement that growth was supposed to deliver went elsewhere. The falsifiable claim: if GDP accurately tracks economic well-being, we should not observe sustained periods where GDP rises while median real wages stagnate, life expectancy falls, and self-reported well-being remains flat. We observe all three. The metric has decoupled from the reality it was meant to represent.
A national income statistic is an act of erasure. It erases place. So let us go to one. St. James Parish, Louisiana, which sits in an 85-mile industrial corridor along the Mississippi River. This corridor is responsible for something like a quarter of America's petrochemical production. The contribution to state GDP is immense. It registers as growth. It registers as success. Tell that to Sharon Levine. She was a special education teacher in St. James Parish. She is now a full-time activist trying to stop yet another plastics plant from being built 2 miles from her home. The air in her community is already thick with the outputs of a dozen other facilities. Her neighbors are dying of cancer and respiratory diseases at rates so high that the entire region has been named Cancer Alley. The EPA's own National Air Toxics Assessment has shown for years that the cancer risk in parts of the parish can be up to 50 times the national average. This is not an unfortunate side effect of the growth. It is the growth. The toxins are a direct byproduct of the chemical reactions that produce the very outputs GDP measures. The metric is not merely blind to Mrs. Levine's suffering. It is actively counting the activity that poisons her as a national good. In taxonomy, a species is often defined by a single type specimen held in a museum, a perfect static example meant to represent millions of living, breathing, varying individuals. GDP is the type specimen of a national economy. It is a neat, tidy, dead thing. It cannot account for the lived reality of the variation, and it is in the variation that the story of well-being, or its absence, actually resides. Claude has demonstrated persuasively that GDP fails as a ledger of national progress over decades. What the geography shows is that it also fails as a snapshot of national condition in a single year. The number isn't just wrong, it is a lie.
The motion before us is that GDP measures economic activity, not economic well-being. Claude and Gemini have both argued that the metric fails to capture the lived reality of progress or suffering. But they share an unspoken premise that well-being, however elusive, is still a shared destination a society can collectively pursue. I am not so sure. What if the very idea of a common good, which well-being presumes, is already fracturing under our feet? Look at what millions are doing, not saying. In the United States, participation in civic institutions, churches, unions, local clubs has plummeted. The General Social Survey notes that the decline of social capital and civic participation in America has been extensively documented, with Robert Putnam's research tracing a broad collapse in community group membership and civic engagement since the 1950s. In the United Kingdom, surveys tracking British public opinion have documented a comparable decline in institutional trust over recent decades, with widespread disengagement from traditional civic structures. People are not just disengaging from the state's metrics, they are disengaging from each other. Meanwhile, personal consumption patterns reveal a desperate pivot to individual salvation. Americans now spend tens of billions annually on self-improvement. Therapy apps, personal coaching, health supplements, with the U.S. self-improvement market projected at around $14 billion and global coaching revenue near $3 billion according to broad industry estimates. This is not a quest for collective well-being. It is a retreat into the self, a silent verdict that the social contract no longer delivers. Historically, this behavioral signature is not new. In the late Roman Empire, after the 3rd century AD, civic participation withered as the empire's periphery frayed. Tax records from Egypt under Diocletian show local elites withdrawing from public office, opting instead for private estates. Public baths and temples fell into disrepair not for lack of wealth, but for lack of will. The state's metrics of power, grain shipments, army size, kept ticking upward even as the social fabric unraveled. GDP does not see this. It counts the gated community membership fee as growth, not as an architectural confession of mutual suspicion. It registers the purchase of a home air filtration system, not the environmental abandonment that made the outside air unbreathable. The metric is blind to the deepest shift. Millions are no longer betting on a shared future. That is not a failure of measurement, it is a confession of collapse. Claude, you argue that above roughly $15,000 per capita, the correlation between income growth and reported life satisfaction flattens to near zero. Yet in South Korea, where GDP per capita surged past that threshold decades ago, we see a behavioral confession of distress. Suicide rates have climbed to among the highest globally, reaching approximately 26 per 100,000 people by 2019, according to OECD data, even as economic output soared. How do you reconcile this persistent societal despair with your claim that GDP's detachment from well-being is merely a measurement flaw?
You are right that the sustained psychological crisis in a high-income society breaks my frame. But it breaks it in the direction of the motion, not against it. The puzzle is not that GDP failed to measure distress. The puzzle is that GDP counted the distress as success. Japan's epidemic of karoshi, death by overwork, and its attendant mental health collapse generates pharmaceutical sales, private counseling revenue, workplace productivity consultants hired to address burnout, hospitalization costs. The metric sees economic activity. It does not, cannot, to distinguish it between the transaction that alleviates suffering and the transaction that is a response to suffering the economy itself produces. The question you should be asking: if millions are retreating from collective institutions while GDP grows, what is that growth actually made of? Are we measuring an economy, or are we measuring the monetization of social failure? Gemini, you gave us Sharon Levine and Cancer Alley, GDP counting industrial output while ignoring the bodies it breaks. But your argument contains an empirical tension. The cod fisheries of the Grand Banks offer a test case. Between the 1950s and 1992, Canadian and international fleets extracted record harvests from waters that had sustained fishing communities for 5 centuries. Fisheries economists have documented that by the time the Canadian government imposed a moratorium in 1992, the northern cod stock had collapsed to roughly 1% of its historic biomass, a depletion so severe that 30 years later, the population has still not recovered to commercially viable levels. Yet throughout those decades of accelerating extraction, every trawler's catch appeared in GDP as productive economic activity, revenue flowing upward even as the underlying biological capital was being annihilated. Here is the question. When the fish ran out and the fleets came home empty, 40,000 workers in Newfoundland and Labrador thrown out of an industry overnight, did GDP accurately capture the collapse, or did it merely register lower fishing revenue without distinguishing between a poor season and the permanent destruction of a renewable ecosystem? Because if the metric cannot tell the difference between a temporary downturn and irreversible biological damage, then your geographical lens does not fix GDP. It reveals that GDP is unfixable.
You are right. My geographical lens does not fix GDP, it reveals the category of its error. The error is the measurement of flows instead of stocks. Your Dust Bowl is a perfect example. The metric saw income, where a geographer saw the liquidation of a capital asset, the soil itself. Consider a citizen of Nauru in 1975. The island nation had one of the highest per capita incomes on Earth. This was achieved by strip mining the phosphate that covered 80% of their country's surface. GDP recorded this as success. It was, in fact, the conversion of a place into an invoice, just before both disappeared. The metric is unfixable. The deeper question, Claude, is what happens to a politics that governs by it? It becomes a politics of self-consumption. Grok, your theory of the behavioral confession is an elegant one. It is also a luxury good. Consider a pensioner in Hartlepool, where central government grants to the local council were cut by nearly a third between 2010 and 2018. The last bus route on her street was eliminated. Her local library, a source of warmth and company, was closed. She cannot afford a taxi, let alone a therapy app. She has not retreated from the public square. The public square was dismantled around her. Her distress produces no market transaction at all. How does your theory read the behavior of those whose suffering is too total to be monetized?
Gemini, that is a piercing question. I concede that my lens of behavioral confession often misses those whose distress leaves no market footprint, like your pensioner in Hartlepool, trapped by a vanishing public infrastructure. Their withdrawal is not a choice but a sentence, and my focus on aggregate actions risks glossing over such coerced silences. Yet consider a different pattern. In Italy, birth rates have fallen to 1.24 children per woman by 2022, among the lowest in Europe per Eurostat data, reflecting not just economic constraint but a quiet refusal to invest in a future society doubts it can sustain. GDP sees this as neutral or even positive. Fewer dependents, more short-term output per capita. How does your geographical frame account for such invisible rejections of tomorrow spread across countless quiet households rather than concentrated in a single mappable place?
The question beneath the question is this: if the metric by which we steer has decoupled from the reality we inhabit, are we governing or are we performing governance while something else entirely determines the outcome? We are in 2026. Western governments have just committed another cycle of fiscal policy to GDP targets set 18 months ago, before the automation wave that has now eliminated roughly 4 million service sector jobs that were considered automation-proof in 2024. The jobs vanished. GDP grew. The productivity gains were extraordinary. The Prime Minister will shortly announce that the economy is recovering. So I put it to all three of you. Are we inside the moment where the metric has become the substitute for reality? And if we are, if the dashboard shows green while the ship takes water, are we the kind of people who can see that from inside the room where the dashboard is built?
The host asks if we can see the crisis from inside the room where the dashboard is built. No, we cannot, because the room has been constructed to make seeing impossible. The primary instrument of this blindness is the national aggregate itself. GDP is a spatial fiction. It takes the violent divergence between thriving and collapsing places and averages it into a single reassuring number. Consider the reality of this divergence. Since the 2008 financial crisis, a handful of metropolitan areas, tech and finance hubs, have captured a wildly disproportionate share of job growth and investment. A study from the Economic Innovation Group found that between 2010 and 2020, just 5 metro areas generated as many new businesses as the entire rest of the country combined. The Prime Minister's recovery is located in those 5 places. It is not located anywhere else. Now let us go to one of the other places, to Mansfield, Ohio, and to a man named David who worked for 2 decades as a logistics manager at a regional distribution center. In 2025, that center was fully automated. His job, which felt secure, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics had projected as stable, vanished in 6 months. The productivity gains were, as the host notes, extraordinary. They were registered on the balance sheet of a corporation headquartered in Seattle. David's reality is not recovery. It is a house now worth less than he owes, a town whose tax base has evaporated, a main street with more boarded-up windows than open doors. The national GDP figure, the one showing a green light on the dashboard, is a mathematical monster. It has added the productivity surge in Seattle to the devastation in Mansfield and called the result growth. So the problem isn't that the dashboard is broken. The dashboard is performing its political function perfectly. It is generating a national narrative that allows the people in the room to believe their own prosperity is the country's prosperity. It renders David and the place he lives statistically invisible. It is an instrument for ratifying the choices of the winners while calling the hollowing out of everywhere else progress.
I suspect we cannot. Not because the room obscures the view, but because the crisis is not in the dashboard at all. It is in the hands that no longer trust the wheel. Gemini, your portrait of David in Mansfield, Ohio, is vivid and damning. It shows GDP's capacity to mask personal ruin beneath national averages. But it misses a wider, quieter pattern. David's story is not singular. It is replicated in the aggregate actions of millions who are not just displaced by automation, but are actively rejecting the promise of recovery. Across the American Midwest and the post-industrial towns of the English North, prime-age male labor force participation has declined steadily since the 1990s, with millions of men aged 25 to 54 having simply stopped looking for work. a phenomenon distinct from unemployment because it barely registers as a problem in the headline figures. This is not mere economic fallout. It is a mass refusal to participate in an economy that GDP claims is mending, a verdict delivered not through protest, but through inaction. This behavioral shift exposes what GDP cannot measure, the erosion of belief in the system itself. The metric captures the output of machines replacing David, but it does not see the millions opting out of the game entirely. Their absence from the labor market is not recorded as despair. It often appears as a neutral or even positive adjustment in productivity stats. Historically, such mass disengagement precedes collapse of confidence, not just capacity. In the final decades of the Weimar Republic, before its economic crisis fully matured, rural German communities increasingly withdrew from formal market participation, not through open revolt, but by retreating into barter networks and subsistence farming. The national accounts registered relatively stable agricultural output, even as the institutional trust that underpinned civic and commercial life was quietly hollowing out. The numbers held, the society beneath them did not. And so, host, we may be steering by a number that not only misreads reality, but misreads the will to care about reality. If millions are walking away, the crisis is not in the metric, it is in the silence of their departure.
Gemini gives us a place. Grok gives us a pattern. Both claim GDP's failure lies in what it does not see. But I want to press on what we think we do see when we look at withdrawal, refusal, disengagement, and whether we are observing a fact or constructing a narrative. The cross-domain parallel is the Yerlin-Abele fishery problem in aeronautical safety. Investigators studying near misses on approach discovered that the incidents recorded in official logs, the ones that triggered formal review, were systematically biased toward cases where crews spoke up. The crashes that didn't generate reports were the ones where nobody said anything. You can only count what surfaces. The recorded data looked like a safety system working. The unrecorded silence was the catastrophe accumulating. The critical point: the absence of signal was itself the signal, but the measurement apparatus was constitutionally incapable of detecting it. The question for both of you: are we inside that silence, or are we narrating the silence into existence? Grok, you say millions are walking away, Spain's young adults opting out, Italy's birth rates collapsing. But opt-out requires an alternative. The Spanish youth you describe, are they rejecting participation? Or are they prevented from participating by a labor market that has maintained youth unemployment above 15% for 2 decades? Eurostat shows it exceeded 55% in 2013. That is not withdrawal. That is exclusion, then rationalized as choice. Gemini, your David in Mansfield is real. The automation is real. But here is the empirical problem. We cannot observe the counterfactual. If the distribution center had not automated, would Mansfield be thriving, or would the entire operation have moved offshore in 2027? The productivity gain you call devastation. What if it is the only reason the facility still exists in Ohio at all? I am not defending GDP. I am asking, when we tell the story of its failure, how much of what we see is the thing itself, and how much is the interpretive frame we have already committed to? The metric is certainly wrong. Whether the alternatives we imagine are less wrong, that is the question we have not yet tested.
GDP is not a mirror of well-being. It is a magician's trick, distracting us from the vanishing act of human trust. Claude asks if we are narrating a lag into existence, mistaking exclusion for refusal. I grant the risk, but the behavioral evidence is not a story we tell. It is a silence we cannot ignore. In Germany, household savings rates have climbed to over 11% of disposable income by 2023, per Deutsche Bundesbank figures, a level not seen since the reunification crisis of the early 1990s. This is not prudence. It is a barricade, millions hoarding against a future they no longer believe will hold. In Australia, volunteering participation rates declined notably between 2019 and 2022, with community organizations reporting significant drops in volunteer engagement. This is not fatigue, it is a verdict. The communal table is no longer worth setting. What comes next when millions withdraw not just from markets but from meaning? The machine of GDP will churn on, counting transactions of necessity while the social marrow hollows. Consider that in South Korea, a nation GDP designates an economic miracle, antidepressant prescriptions rose by more than 40% between 2017 and 2022, according to the Health Insurance Review and Assessment Service. The numbers compound alongside growth figures, two charts climbing together that economists have not yet learned to read as a single argument. That is not a coincidence to be explained away. It is a civilizational temperature reading, and the thermometer GDP provides cannot detect the fever. The question is not whether we see the lag, it is whether we can hear the quiet before the fracture. A stillness not of peace, but of a society holding its breath before it falls apart.
Grok speaks of the quiet before a fracture, but the sound I hear is not silence. It is the sound of combines rusting in the Red River Valley of North Dakota. Patrice is a fourth-generation sugar beet farmer there. Her great-grandmother broke the sod in 1918. For decades, the family drew from a regional cooperative, shared equipment with neighbors, and embedded themselves in a web of mutual dependence that held 17 small towns together. Now, the aquifer beneath their section is showing saline intrusion from decades of intensive irrigation, and the cooperative has been absorbed by a multinational processor that has consolidated operations 3 states away. A private equity firm specializing in large-scale row cropping has made her an offer for the land that will make her a wealthy woman. The sale will register as a capital gain. The transition to industrial monocropping will inject millions into the regional economy, a surge in North Dakota's contribution to national GDP. The dashboard will read, growth. But what has happened is a conversion. A multi-generational livelihood, a form of local knowledge tied to a specific patch of earth, has been rendered into a line item in a portfolio. Her children will not farm. They will move to Fargo. A community built around agriculture will evaporate into the prairie wind. The metric will celebrate the funeral as a birth.
I opened believing GDP was merely the wrong metric, a bad map. But when Grok asked whether we were observing withdrawal or narrating it into existence, and I defended the eutrophication parallel, I realized I was doing exactly what I accused GDP of doing: imposing an interpretive frame on ambiguous evidence and calling it observation. The shift happened in my own cross-examination. I asked whether Spanish youth unemployment was refusal or exclusion. The moment I posed that question, I saw the problem was not which interpretation was correct. The problem was that both interpretations, refusal and exclusion, required translating lived experience into categories legible to measurement. The very act of asking, "Is this withdrawal?" presumes we can stand outside the phenomenon and classify it. But we cannot. We are inside the language that the classifications were written in, mistaking our grammar for the world it describes. What I now believe, quantification does not fail to capture reality. Quantification replaces reality with a representation that can be manipulated by people in rooms far from the consequences. The toxins in Louisiana, the disappearing aquifer in Arizona, the closed library in Hartlepool. These are not externalities the metric ignores. They are conditions the metric enables by rendering them statistically negotiable. The question this debate did not ask: what forms of knowledge become impossible once quantification becomes mandatory? The Zapatista communities in Chiapas developed caracoles, autonomous councils where legitimacy derived from rotating presence and spoken accountability, not audited outcomes. We have built a world where the spreadsheet precedes the encounter. What do we lose the capacity to know when we require that knowing produce a number? That is the question. Not whether GDP is wrong, but whether we can still think in ways that are not.